Well, hello everyone. My name is Mark Mormons. I'm Senior Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Venture Development with the Arizona Commerce Authority. I'm excited to present this afternoon's safety session for the Arizona Small Business Bootcamp and Resource Collective. For those of you just joining us, first want to thank our partners. This bootcamp we could not put on without the support of partners across the state, and we're very excited to be working with groups like Local First Arizona, the SBDCs of Arizona, and many of our universities and community groups to bring this content to you each week. The Small Business Bootcamp is a daily bootcamp for businesses with 20 employees or less for coaching and content on how to navigate the COVID crisis and return stronger once the economy begins to reopen. It's a statewide initiative, again, supported by those community partners that I mentioned on the previous page. And it's a daily bootcamp. Sessions are from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. every day. And then we have some safety sessions like today in the afternoon. And it's going to be running through June. We had originally signed up for kind of through the end of May, but because the content has been so rich and had such an impact, we're going to keep this going through June at the least. There's also a resource collective component. I'll link to some websites and resources that you can see all of the additional resources that are available to you from our partners across the state to help you in navigating the current COVID crisis. So this week, we had more great content for you. All of this was recorded and is available on our website. I'll link to that in the chat in just a moment. On Monday, we had a session on navigating the legal implications for your workforce returning back to work. On Tuesday, we had a session from our local entrepreneur, Chris Ronzio, on how to revamp and innovate within your business for the post-COVID world. On Wednesday, we had a session with Kaiser on how to kind of avoid chaos and navigate your new physical workspace. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by the Arizona chapter of the National Safety Council regarding different safety implications and how to make sure that you, your employees, and your customers are safe in the workplace. And tomorrow, we have a very special session with a member of Facebook's global marketing team who works with their largest enterprise big box retailers across the world. She'll be talking about different Facebook tools that they've developed to support small businesses during this. We've also got some great sessions lined up for next week. You can go onto our website, which I'll post in the chat, to register for next week's sessions as well. And for now, I'll hand it over to Robert Theobald from the Arizona Commerce Authority to give some quick updates on where we are at with the CARES Act and PPP funding.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this afternoon session of the boot camp. Some updates on PPP. As of May 16th, the funds were sitting at $114 billion. The way it was trending right before the 16th is we're probably sitting at about $110 billion still. We're waiting for some more detailed breakdowns from the SBA on those numbers, but there are funds in the PPP program. I would encourage you, if you are waiting to hear back from your lender and their communication is not that good, to reach out to us. We can guide you to some lenders, some local lenders that have promised some speedy responses to the loan applications and through that process. Also, just a note, Arizona has received over $8.5 billion in loans from the PPP program in rounds 1 and 2, which is pretty substantial. And then we've been hearing from a number of different companies that they have started to see the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan funds, the actual loans start to flow and start to see some of those in their businesses. So that's great news. So Mark, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Robert. In addition to the Small Business Bootcamp, there's a number of other resources and programs that you can take advantage of. Our partners at the SBDCs of Arizona, there's chapters all over the state, provide kind of business coaching, connections to local lenders, as well as a number of business resources and templates. The Arizona Commerce Authority has recently launched the Arizona at Work initiative, helping with recertifications, trainings, and job finding. And we also have the Arizona MEP program, which is a really fantastic resource for manufacturing in the state. I encourage you to check out each of those programs. Additionally, the governor's office has put together a website, arizonatogether.org, which aggregates and compiles resources from across the state to help support businesses in this time. You can see there on the bottom, they've got individual resources, business resources, opportunities to volunteer, donate, all things COVID-19. We've also taken the liberty of compiling several resources and guides on kind of the reopening process. So whether you are a barber, cosmetologist, restaurateur, or retailer, hotelier, there are all sorts of guides, informational resources for you to kind of make a plan for returning back to work. You can check any of these out at our website or also at that aztogether.org website. Finally, I'd encourage you all to visit our site at azcommerce.com/COVID-19 for the latest news, updates, resources to support business owners. So today, like I mentioned, I'm very excited to be joined here today with two members of the Arizona chapter of the National Safety Council. We've got Ed Tauby and Amber Pappas. They've presented for us this morning and last week, and the information is just really critical for businesses, and they present it in such a clear, concise way. Great tips. So we'll have time at the end of the session for Q&A. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat box or the Q&A tool. But for now, I'm happy to hand over the session to Ed and Amber. So I will stop sharing my screen and give them access.
Mark, thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today to work with your group, and hopefully you'll find the information to be very helpful for you. So as Mark mentioned, my name is Ed Tauby. I'm one of the trainers here at the Arizona Chapter National Safety Council. Our primary training is first aid, CPR, and roadway safety, a lot of different defensive driving type courses. But we also train forklift instructors, construction zone flagger, and advanced safety certificate courses that are developed by the National Safety Council. So we can offer a wide variety of training to fit whatever needs you might have for your particular business. Joining me today is Amber Pappas, President of Safety Help Today. And Amber, take a second and introduce yourself, please.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, for allowing me to participate and be here with you all today. I'm excited for this session. As Ed mentioned, I am the president of Safety Help Today. We work with workplaces of all size, type, assisting with OSHA compliance and safety training needs. I am also lucky to be one of the trainers here at the Arizona Chapter of National Safety Council. I work with Ed and some of the other trainers with the advanced safety certificate programs, fundamentals of industrial hygiene, job safety analysis, all that good stuff. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Awesome, Amber. Happy to have you join us. So let's kind of get into what we want to do, and we'll start with our goals. We have presented this information about 6 different times now, and some of you may have been part of those presentations, some of you may not, but today what we did is we kind of took that basic information that we started with a couple weeks ago, and we're going to go a couple steps further. So if you do not have not participated in the previous ones, Mark can send you the links for those, and you can certainly listen to those, but we've taken that information and kind of added to it. We've kept a few of those slides and some of that information because it's very, very relevant to what we're teaching today, but we've also kind of increased our reach. So we want to go beyond the basics and provide you assistance as your workplaces start up again. We know that there's been a lot of effects on the workplaces. As you're back, you know you're going to have to make some changes to your operations. There's going to be some reductions on how many people you can have in your building at any given time. You may have to redesign some workspaces, and all this uncertainty kind of adds to the stress, and people are concerned because they've been either off work at home, working remotely. Some people have been furloughed and they're coming back. So there is a fair amount of stress and uncertainty because, and we also don't know, moving forward how this virus is going to behave. So we want to make sure that when we're doing things, we're addressing that stress and uncertainty level, both in our associates and our customers that are coming to see us. So how is COVID-19 spread? Primary source is large respiratory droplets. They fall to earth pretty quickly. That's where we get this 6-foot distancing guideline, because beyond that, the larger droplets are usually already drop to the surface or the floor. Secondary sources, aerosols, which are really fine mists, and contaminated surfaces where somebody might touch one of those surfaces and then with their hands touch their eyes, nose, mouth. The mucous membranes of those 3 areas is how the virus is introduced into your body. there were some reports that actually came out yesterday, and these are news reports, so they're not confirmed from anything I've seen from CDC yet, but CDC, according to these reports, has kind of downplayed the contaminated surfaces. Maybe a little bit less concerned about that, but certainly the primary droplets or primary sources, the large droplets, are the ones we have to pay attention to, because this virus can remain active for periods of time, up to 2 to 3 days on plastic or stainless steel. So it is something we do have to be aware as the virus on the surfaces. So we have to have some cleaning regimens and different processes there. But we have to be a lot more aware of the droplet itself. In our workplaces, OSHA does not have specific regulations directly related to COVID-19 specifically, but there are a number of their regulations and policies that do cover this. And one is the general duty clause. Basically, it says you as a business owner have an obligation to furnish a workplace that is safe from hazards. And these are not only safety issues, but health issues at the same time. And obviously the COVID-19 is more of a health issue. And at the same time, that same clause says each employees have an obligation to follow these safety and health standards and follow the rules and regulations so that they are protected as well. So if you want to go into more detail on the general duty clause, just Google it and it'll tell you exactly all the ins and outs of this, but that's kind of a generalization. So where do you start? You know, you're back and you have this blank slate in front of you, right? My suggestion is start with a clean facility. Whatever you need to do to clean the facility or sanitize it, whatever level, is going to depend on the type of business that you have, how long you've been closed, if there have been people in and out on a regular basis, maybe working remotely but coming in part-time. So figure out what the level of cleaning and sanitization, because that's going to reduce stress. If your employees are coming back and they see everything's freshly cleaned, they're going to feel better about coming back to your workplace, and your customers are going to notice the same thing. With this, we're suggesting you assign a leader that's going to be directly responsible for handling these COVID issues, but at the same time involve other people. So form a task force or a committee. Some companies are really small and only have 1 or 2 people in the entire company. Others are a bit larger, and you can form these committees and task force. The important thing is get a variety of input as to some of the issues you need to resolve, because your employees that are just coming in and seeing the place for the first time or doing their regular jobs may be exposed to things that you're not used to seeing yourself. So you want to make sure that you have a level of communication so that we can talk both ways as to what's going on. You want to do an analysis of your company to determine what your potential for exposure is, or exposures are for your specific business, and identify any gaps you may have in your procedures and policies and controls. We want to talk about a little bit more in depth about emergency preparedness, but more specifically disease prevention plans. Those are 2 different topics, but if we're doing planning and making sure that everything is safe, we will spend a little bit of time on the emergency side, but we're going to focus a lot more on the disease prevention. And we need to have an orientation for our people that are coming back, similar to a new hire, where you bring them in and you just kind of tell them exactly what you're doing to make them feel comfortable and safe and make sure the business operates well, but you're doing it in a safe manner that's going to conform to the guidelines that you have to follow. And in order to do that, you have to have a really good line of communication. You want to be supportive, encourage that 2-way exchange of ideas, focus on the positive aspects. Hey, we're reopening. We're going to do everything we can to be successful. Yes, we're going to have to adapt, but these are changes that maybe we're overdue anyway. We probably should have been doing some of this in the past and just didn't realize it. And try to do those positive things and reduce that fear and anxiety. And along those same lines, there may be some accommodations you have to consider because there are people coming back and you don't know what their home situation is. If they've been unemployed, maybe there's some additional stress there. If they've had to care for people that are sick, daycares are not operating, so the kids are home too, and their life has kind of been a bit different lately than usual, and that can lead to some mental health or maybe even some substance abuse issues. So we want to be aware of those and try to accommodate as much as we can, because we value our employees. They're humans, and we want to take good care of our fellow humans, right? So where do we start? This website, I put it on this page and not in the resources because I really, really want you to write this one down. If you have no clue on where to start, this is a great point to go to. It has updated standards. This is a constantly changing evolution of things with this virus. So there's updates, talks about how to do hazard recognition surveys. It provides a lot of medical information. And what I really like is there's a ton of industry specific guidelines. So if you're a taxi driver, it tells you, what to do there. If you're a construction worker. So this is kind of some screenshots of what you're going to see on that page. And as you can see under the highlights tab and under the control and prevention tabs, there's some very specific guidelines they've come up with for dentists and healthcare and meat and poultry processing, airlines, retails, taxi cabs. So your business may not fit one of those categories exactly, but there's going to be something that's similar to what you're doing that you're going to be able to tap into those resources, and it should be helpful. So that's a great starting point. The next thing you can do is what's called a job hazard or a job safety analysis. And I want to emphasize that this doesn't have to be a really complicated thing. What we want to do is try to break down our jobs into individual tasks or individual steps. An example would be a job as an electrician, but a task or a step would be to change out an electrical outlet. So instead of worrying about all the stuff an electrician has to do, focus on that task and write down the steps associated with that, identify any potential hazards that may be associated with it, and then identify some controls and put those into place. So you can do this a lot on the safety side, and these are more geared toward the safety side. However, the same process and principles apply to disease prevention. So let's say you have a clerk at a hotel at the front desk. So what kind of hazards would they be exposed to? Yes, there's some safety things, slips, trips, and falls, and some other things. But on the disease prevention side, they're going to be in closer contact with customers. There's surfaces that have to be taken into account on keeping those disinfected. They may be needed to wear some sort of face coverings. You might implement some engineering controls such as barriers. So identify, looking at it from a disease prevention standpoint, use that same process to identify those risks, specify your controls. This next page has a job safety analysis form. This is the National Safety Council form, and it follows those steps. Sequence the basic jobs, identify your potential hazards, and then whatever procedure or action, put that down. Now, I'm going to encourage you, as you do these for these various tasks, save them for a couple of reasons. One is they're going to be very, very valuable if you do have an OSHA compliance officer come to your business. This is evidence of you exhibiting due diligence on trying to make sure you're identifying hazards and putting proper controls into place. The other thing is, this is valuable information, and sometimes things will change and you have to pull out this job safety analysis and revise it. So now instead of starting from scratch, you're just making a few changes and then you're re-implementing those changes. So once again, I don't want this to be an overwhelming job that's going to just bury you. I want it to be simple and straightforward, and it's very repeatable, and it's very, very effective. So let's talk briefly about emergency preparedness. And as I mentioned earlier, emergency preparedness is a little bit different issue from disease prevention. Emergency preparedness handles what do you do in the case of fire or storms or power outages or different types of things where you might have to evacuate the building or have to implement some safety procedures, whether it's shelter in place or leave. So OSHA does require most businesses to have an emergency action plan. These, once again, this is not a real complicated process, and they have an e-tool, and the link for that is in the resources page at the end of the presentation. But you can just go onto that e-tool, fill in the blanks. It's going to ask you a series of questions. You just answer them. In about 15-20 minutes, you can have a basic emergency action plan that meets the OSHA standards. And this will be effective for most small businesses. Now, obviously, if you have an automobile manufacturing plant, that's a little bit different story. There's a lot of complexities there as far as the hazards and how to prepare. But emergency preparedness is important, even related to the pandemic, because there may be some shutdowns that have to take place. And then when you shut down again, you have to have a process of how to do that effectively, who's essential has to remain behind versus who leaves. And so you need to have those kind of things identified. But on the disease prevention and preparedness part, that's where I'm going to turn it over to Amber, and she's going to take it from here for a few minutes.
Thank you, Ed. So I want to, before I get into this, I want to kind of go back to the basics again. Ed brought up earlier the general duty clause. So as an employer, I understand that a lot of this can be overwhelming. We're talking about emergency action plans, disease prevention plans, all of this stuff, where to start. So let's go back to the basics again. Every employer has an obligation to provide a place of employment free from hazards, right? And that those hazards can be safety and health. The health side is often the side that gets neglected, challenged, and we do see some citations that come out of that and a lot of risk. And so that's why we wanted to throw this in. When you're looking to start writing and putting into, you've done your assessments, as Ed has kind of shown us how to do. So now you're trying to put the pen to paper, right? And we want to develop this disease prevention preparedness plan. We want to incorporate what we call industrial hygiene concepts. You want to take a look at the 4 main hazard types associated, and these are the health hazards. We see physical hazards, which are more of your noise, radiation. We'll see vibration, those types of things, but biological. So biological hazards can be occupational exposures that include bacteria, viruses, fungi, other living organisms that can cause infections or diseases. In there, we see the bloodborne pathogens, which is any occupation that has the potential exposure to come into contact with bodily fluids. So that's where we get a lot of this from. Ergonomics is how we do our jobs, the wear and tear on the human body, how we sit, how we move, bend, pull, lift. And then lastly, chemical. We see chemical hazards. They come in all different forms: solids, liquids, gases. Your workers can be exposed through absorption through the skin, inhalation, ingesting through eating and drinking processes. So we want to take a look when you're doing your hazard assessments and you're putting this disease preparedness plan. Think beyond COVID, right? You may already have some plans in place, but if you're starting from scratch, do your hazard assessments, think beyond COVID, but let's analyze all of these hazard types and use the processes of industrial hygiene, which is to anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and then put in controls, which I'll talk a little bit later about. But again, some references, if you don't know where to start, the bloodborne pathogen standards, there's some good templates that you can kind of start with and then work from, but you also want to make sure whatever you put and include, look at the PPE standards, look at the respiratory protection standards as well. I'll get into that a little bit later, but let's get started on putting this plan together. So when you've done your assessments and you're working on getting it written, before you get everything worked out, Ed kind of touched about this a little bit, but let's get some general precautions put in place right away. I think most of us have already done that. We're working on the social distancing. We're educating our employees on respiratory etiquette. What does that mean? Sneezing into a tissue or your elbow, not touching other surfaces, hygiene and sanitizing standardizing policies. So if we're putting things in place where maybe we're not using the same equipment, we're not sharing tools or workstations, PPE, hand washing, all of that stuff. These are really good general precautions that you can start off with right away. As you're in the process of doing your hazard analysis and you don't really have it done yet, let's start with these. And then as we get, we've done our assessments, now we can work on implementing controls. And so when I use the word controls, I want to talk about, I love this upside down triangle. This upside down triangle, OSHA and most safety professionals refer to this framework. It's one of the best ways to control hazards because the reason is the approach is a systematic approach where you're using a system rather than relying on human behavior to control, to identify and possibly eliminate the hazards. So if you take a look at this triangle, you'll see on the left side of it, we've got that arrow that kind of slides up and down it, right? And so as you go up the triangle, you see more effective, and I'll give some examples of that, controls. And then as you slide down, these controls are considered to be less effective. And OSHA often refers to this as well. Matter of fact, they have some good memos that they've put out on that COVID site that Ed referenced, imploring employers to take a look at your plans, take a look at what you've got in place. Don't just jump to PPE because we're seeing a lack of PPE, but also there's some implications if you're not trying to at least eliminate the hazard or maybe engineer it out. And so at the top, we've got elimination. If we can remove the hazard, that's great. Right? So, in examples with safety, it's maybe a fall. So we eliminate the fall hazard. But in health, that can be a challenge with some of these, when you're putting your program for some of these biological hazards or, again, referring back to COVID, sometimes we can't always eliminate it. So then we're going to go down that triangle, substitution, right? That can include maybe we substitute out a certain chemical, a lesser toxic chemical for a water-based chemical. A lot of biological hazards can come from that. Chemical hazards definitely come from that. So I wanted to see that before I get into specifics of engineering, administrative, and PPE. But one last thing before we move to the next slide, take a look at PPE again. It's the last. What happens when all controls fail and so do PPE? Your workers are exposed. They're exposed to injury and illness. That is why it's super important when you're putting your program together, do not jump right to PPE. I work constantly throughout the week working with employers when I'm assessing their plans and their sites, and all I see is PPE. Hey, well, we're forcing our people to wear, face masks, and that's it. We want to implement other controls and not just jump right to PPE. So next, I want to spend just a little bit of time on the Swiss cheese model. I love this term. So in that triangle, you've done your assessment, you've realized your exposures, your risks, and I want to point out it's not a one-size-fits-all. If you see on the left side of the Swiss cheese model, you've got an event or a hazard, and then the Swiss cheese, they represent your controls. So maybe you've got an engineering control in place, and then an administrative, and then maybe a PPE. Sometimes certain hazards, they'll pass through those holes like they do, like Swiss cheese. So you're going to implement more than one control. We're not going to just do PPE. We're not going to just use maybe a safe work procedure. We are going to combine multiple layers of controls with the goal of, again, stopping those hazards or those events from reaching the worker at the front line and who we're trying to protect. So keep that in mind when you're putting your programs together. You've got your hazards, you've got your exposures. Now, what are we going to do to prevent it? And we're going to use a combination of effective controls. So when putting controls together, again, we talked about elimination and substitution obviously being the best, but sometimes it's just not practical within our workforce. And so we're going to take a look at the next one down is engineering. Engineering controls involve isolating employees away from work-related hazards, and these types of controls reduce exposures without relying on worker behavior. So as you see, we've given you a couple of examples. Increased ventilation, maybe it's it's general ventilation or local exhaust ventilation, but physical barriers. Again, we're isolating your workforce from even coming into contact or the potential contact with the hazard. So in this example, you'll see that the physical barrier guards, right? That doesn't require anything. It doesn't require your employees to do anything. All you have to do is install it. Maybe we're going to reconfigure workplaces. Do we have areas where employees tend to roam around, like the break room, right? And so, or is there a waiting area? Maybe where employees come in to fill out, future employees come to fill out applications. Maybe we're gonna take a look at the layout of that. We're gonna separate and isolate. Maybe we install touch-free restroom faucets and towel dispensers. One great thing, you know, I thought it's so simple, but yet so important, and was take a look at all the doors that your workers have to open and touch as they're walking through your facilities. Maybe we just keep them permanently propped open for a while because that's less room for contact, less clean, you know, the cleaning and the touching. So those are certain types of engineering controls that you can put into your plan, again, with the goal of protecting your workers and not jumping right to the PPE. On this next slide, when we can't, and sometimes, you know, we've got the engineering controls in place, but we feel like, you know, we still need a little bit more, or maybe we can't install physical barriers. There's, you know, some constraints with that. We want to take a look at administrative controls. These controls require action by someone, whether it's you, the employer, or your worker. Somebody has to do something. That's why they're a little bit down on that hierarchy of controls triangle. But we see things like staggered work hours. Again, break times. Let's take a look at that. Does everybody take break at 11? Maybe we change it a little bit. Maybe we, you know, so-and-so is going to start at this time. They take their break at that time. We're using those administrative work policies to hopefully separate and prevent some of the you know, the spread, right? Safe work practices, things like you know, having policies where we're not sharing workstations, we're not sharing phones. If I go to Ed's workstation and happen to type some things on his keyboard and then I go and touch mine. So having policies in place of the hygiene part of it, the disinfecting part of it, where they're going to go, travel policies. We want to take a look at what's essential and what's not essential. In here, you'll see where we have disinfectant and hygiene procedures. This is an administrative control, and I want to point that out. It's in here because it tends to be more effective than jumping right to PPE. If we disinfect, we're somewhat removing that hazard versus just wearing a mask. And so it's important you understand that. Signage is great. It's another great reminder to your employees of some of the worst safe work procedures that you have in place. And then educating and training. I've seen really elaborate, great plans and great programs put in place, but where employers, you know, kind of miss the mark is we're not training our workforce on what it is that we're doing. Ed talked a little bit about this is our opportunity to communicate. This is our opportunity to get rid of the fear. We have got to educate and train your workers on what it is you're doing. Why is that physical guard there? Why is it that I can't go and use my coworker's phone? Why, you know, why is it that I have to take break a certain time? Educate them, empower them, allow them to be the part of the process so that these controls are effective. So the last one on that triangle is PPE. Again, it is your last line of defense. And so this is why it's important we don't jump right to it, because if this fails, if any form of PPE fails, whether it's gloves, gowns, you know, respirators, face, whatever it might be, if fails, your workers are exposed. And so that's why, again, I can't say it enough. Start at the top and then work your way down to this. So if you're using the Swiss cheese model, you've got other things in place, and now you're determining, you know what, we want an extra control in here. We're going to implement some PPE. Make sure you do your research on PPE. There can definitely be some good, but there can also be some implications. There's a lot of regulations tied to PPE. OSHA, this is where we do see it. OSHA has regulations holding employers accountable to proper PPE selection, training employees on how to properly fit, use, carry prepare and dispose of the PPE. And so if you're going to choose PPE, you need to make sure that logistically you can handle all of the regulations tied to it. And I'll give you one example. We see in this picture the N95 mask. I was at a salon not too long ago, and I saw a worker wearing the N95 that had one of the external, the excess flow valve. And obviously it was one of those things, the employer put a policy in place, you must wear this, but I knew right away that they weren't educated, because that excess flow valve, if you cough or sneeze, it actually releases those aerosols. So if you're going to put stuff in place, find out if it's going to work. Also, do you have access to it? And then additionally, are there regulations more tied to it? If you are going to mandate that your workforce wear respirators, you have to have a written respiratory protection program. You have to have policies in place where your workers are fit tested, that they go through a medical evaluation, and that they're trained. And the reason being is because we need to make sure, are your workers medically capable of wearing it? Are you creating a greater hazard? Maybe they have asthma. Maybe there's other issues to where you could create an injury or an illness by forcing them. So just make sure, what PPE is great, make sure that you've done your education, or excuse me, your research, and that you're prepared to handle all of it, you know, with all that comes with the selection of PPE. So we wanted to spend just a couple of minutes. I wish I could talk, Ed knows this, I could talk a couple hours on record keeping and reporting, but I'm gonna just highlight a couple things because we've received quite a few questions on this portion of it. So I get, you know, hey Amber, what if somebody's tested positive? Is this a recordable? So Ed gave you the link to the OSHA website. There is some great information. They've got great Q&A on this, but I want to point out COVID-19 can be a recordable illness, and employers can be responsible for recording, but I want to point out the ifs with the criteria. So the 1904.5, the determination if it's work-related. So you've got to ask yourself, one, is the case a confirmed case of COVID-19 per the CDC? Please, I implore you, check that out. I've gotten phone calls, Amber, you know, somebody tested positive for COVID-19, and I asked those questions. Have you confirmed it? Well, no, it was actually COVID-61. It was this, this, and this. So confirm it. Second, confirm whether or not it's work relatable. Again, 1904.5, they've got some great Q&As on what's considered work relatable, what's not. You know, maybe they're showing symptoms at work, but you can determine that the exposure came from, you know, in the public or not at work. That's key. And then the last one is going to be, is that does the case involve one or more of the recording criteria that's set forth in 1904.7? That's things like, was there a death? Was there an injury or illness? Was there loss of consciousness, days away from work, restricted or light duty? So these non-first aid. So if it meets all of those criterias, you've determined that, then it could be a recordable. But I want to point out, go and check out OSHA's website, because they've also given some additional guidance on whether they're going to enforce it, because this is a challenge, right? It's hard to know whether it happened at work, whether it didn't. And so they're giving us a little bit of grace with this, but they've also put on their website areas where they will hold employers accountable for recording it. Reporting, not going to spend a lot of time, but you can check out reporting on 1904.39. They've got some requirements with that. But those of you that have never seen it, what do you mean to record, Amber? Well, recording is in the event of something that meets all that criteria, you have this OSHA Form 300, you got to write it down. Again, there's a lot of good instructions on it. This can be, well, Amber, what column do I mark? How many days? All of that stuff. Check out the OSHA website. They've got some good information. But employers with 10 or more, and if you meet certain high hazard industries, you are required to record work-related injuries and illnesses. So I wanted to throw that in there for you. Lastly, I want to talk about, so when I was discussing your disease prevention plans, having certain controls in place. One is, let's have infection protocol. Let's already have written in place, what are we going to do if somebody, you know, is test positive? What are we going to do if a worker comes in and says, hey, I heard that Ed, you know, tested positive and I was working next to him for the last 4 days. You're going to get that. So instead of waiting until it happens, let's have some plans in place. And I like that Ed put this in here. Sometimes we'll see it's important to define what type of exposures. You'll see things like primary exposure. An individual has been diagnosed and confirmed COVID-19. So what type of procedures are you going to put in place? Are we going to quarantine them until they've been released by a doctor and you have documented negative results? Who are you going to notify? Are we going to do an incident investigation? Find out who was in the area, where that person was working? What are we going to do to disinfect and contaminate, right? And then next we see primary symptoms and direct exposure. These are team members that have been indirectly in contact with somebody that's primary. So what are we going to do? Are we going to send them out for testing? Again, there's a lot of resources with testing. So if they come back with a negative test result, they're cleared. Who are we going to notify? Again, all of that. Secondary exposure, maybe we don't have them quarantined. They don't necessarily need to go through the testing, but we're going to educate them, have them do some self-monitoring, signs and symptoms to look out for. And then lastly, we see the tertiary. Again, this is somebody that might have been in contact with a secondary, I know I always say that wrong, tertiary, thank you, I appreciate that, Ed, that's a tough one for me. But again, taking a look at it, so my whole point in putting this in there is don't lump everybody into one category as primary. That's what I'm seeing today. Evaluate and identify the different levels and have procedures ready to go so that your team can handle the different levels of exposures. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ed, who's going to finish this up and talk a little bit about what to do before your employees enter the workforce.
Thank you, Amber. Awesome job with that information. Some of it's pretty complicated. Others are a little less so, but you did a great job of presenting in a way that's very understandable. So let's talk about, before we return to the workplace, what are we going to do? Some companies may implement some new screening measures. Some companies may interview you before you come back, or have you fill out a paper questionnaire, or sign an affidavit that by signing this, you acknowledge that whatever the criteria is on that affidavit. They may ask you some of your medical history, or some companies are taking temperature checks before people can enter these buildings. And all of these are valid things to try to implement, but what you do have to be aware of is some of these can create some HR issues for you. And so let's talk about what some of those are. When we talk about health records and medical privacy, the default in our brain is always HIPAA, right? Because everybody knows about HIPAA. You stand in line at the pharmacy and you have to stay back because of HIPAA. And they, not that you can't hear what's going on, but at least there's some sort of attempt to keep everything private. But HIPAA regulates healthcare providers and insurers and people that process those types of claims. HIPAA does not apply to the general workplace. However, ADA and EEOC regulations do apply to the workplace. And OSHA comes into play because many HR policies are related to OSHA compliance. So if you have a policy at your company that everybody needs to wear face coverings or mask or some sort of PPE, and you mandate that to meet an OSHA requirement, a lot of times that falls under the heading of human resources, because if people refuse to do that, then there's also, you know, what are you going to do? How do you handle that? Is there discipline involved? Is there termination involved? So, and in many companies, especially the smaller ones, the HR person is always also the safety person. They're wearing 2 or 3 different hats. So a lot of the HR policies are directly related to OSHA compliance, but we're going to focus more on the ADA, which is legislation that was written to protect people with disabilities and make sure that there's equal opportunities both to get jobs and to keep jobs with accommodations for various disabilities. EEOC is more anti-discrimination laws, and there are some overlaps between EEOC regulations and ADA, especially when it relates to age and disabilities and privacy. So let's go a little bit deeper into some of these, because what's happened once the pandemic was officially declared by the CDC, it did change some of the processes that you're allowed to use at work to help identify if somebody has a potential symptoms or possibly has the disease. And the term direct threat is a real key here, especially under the ADA standards. And what that means is a direct threat is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. If an individual with a disability poses a direct threat despite reasonable accommodation, he or she is not protected from the non-discrimination provisions of ADA. So to get to this point, to figure out if somebody is a direct threat, some people are, or some companies are instituting policies where they are asking people information, and with good intention. Let's say you come back to work and maybe the employee is a little bit older and they fall into the high risk category because of their age. And maybe they appear to be a bit overweight, or maybe you know that they might have some other underlying health issues. Well, one thing you can't do is just ask them directly, hey, do you have any medical issues or ongoing health considerations that would put you at greater risk? So you can't ask a direct question like that. However, you can ask them, have you exhibited any of the signs and symptoms of COVID-19? That's not going to lead to anything that's going to expose a disability, where the other question would. So how you answer these questions and try to gather any medical information is going to be a little bit tricky, and you have to be really, really careful. The other factor that's going to come into play is, we mentioned medical examination. Taking someone's temperature under the ADA standards is considered a medical examination. And I'll read their definition. It's a procedure or test that seeks information about an individual's physical or mental impairments or health. Whether a procedure is medical examination under ADA is determined by considering factors such as whether the test involves the use of medical equipment, whether it's invasive, whether it's designed to reveal the existence of a physical or mental impairment, and whether it's given or interpreted by a medical professional. Normally, under regular times, ADA does not allow you to conduct medical examinations of your employees. However, when we get back to the term of direct threat and declaration of the pandemic, the CDC has identified this pandemic as a direct threat. And so now if somebody exhibits signs and symptoms of COVID, you could consider that to be a direct threat. And now it opens up other possibilities of addressing that issue rather than asking, are you at higher risk? So that's a really key thing here, is the pandemic was declared, which means the direct threat is there, which allows you now to take those temperatures. One thing I've got to caution you about is, if you are implementing a policy where everybody has to have their temperature taken, there's some factors that are going to affect somebody's body temperature or skin temperature. And a lot of people are using a thermal scanning type device, but if I stand outside in the sunlight on a 105-degree day and I walk directly into the building, my skin's going to be hot. And if they take my temperature right away, it's going to show I have a fever, or at least that's the interpretation, when I may not have one at all. So there's very few controls here if you're just doing it randomly, so you have to be careful. And the other thing is, you have to make sure that any medical information you're gathering is kept private. So if you have a line of 15 people waiting to get their temperature taken, and you scan Bob and his temperature is 98.6, you say, 98.6, you're good to go, Bob, have a nice day. Well, now you've just revealed medical information about Bob. And if the next guy comes up and you take his and his temperature is a couple degrees elevated, and you say, no, dude, you got a fever, you got to go home. Once again, you've just now revealed medical information that should be kept private. So you have to be really, really careful about gathering the information and protecting the privacy of that individual, because you're not allowed to disclose this type of information to other people, okay? The other thing that employees are doing are some surveys, and they might ask, hey, has anybody in your family been diagnosed with COVID? You can't answer that, or you can't ask that. You can ask, has anybody, have you been in direct contact with anybody that has had COVID? Then you can ask that question, but you can't ask about specific people. The other thing is, you can't ask about things that are going to expose a potential, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. A potential ADA consideration that you have to accommodate for. So you can ask a series of questions, and some of them are medical related and some of them are non-medical. For example, if you ask, hey, I have in the event of a pandemic, would you be able to come to work under these circumstances? One, if you don't have daycare. 2, if services were unavailable for you to care for other dependents. 3, if public transportation is available. Or 4, if you're in a high-risk category based on your pre-existing conditions. Now, that 4th question you can't answer directly, but if you put it with the other 3 that are non-medical related, and you answer yes or no to the whole series of questions without disclosing which one of those fits, then you can ask that question. Okay, so once again, we have to make sure we're not exposing disabilities. That's the term I was looking for earlier, and had a little brain moment, right? And at the same time, ADA also says you have to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And there's levels of accommodations that come into play, and you also want to make sure that at some point, some of those accommodations could be considered an undue hardship on the business too. So there's, once again, our intent isn't here to dig really deep into this, but we want to make you aware and give you kind of a 30,000-foot view of some of the things you have to think about, because a lot of people aren't familiar with ADA or EEOC or some of these other regulations. So once again, you can have great intentions and you want to protect people and keep them safe, but you have to do it in a way that complies with these standards. So along the way, we've talked about developing plans and implementing controls. What I really want you to think about too is contingency plans. Okay, we've got everything kind of rolling in, and then something happens that kind of disrupts the process. Whether it's you have to shut down again, maybe the disease rates start to spike again, and they have to implement some different procedures. We need to just make sure we have a plan in place in case any of that happens. We hope it doesn't, and we're confident that the people that are making these decisions are correct in their assessments, but there's still a lot of unknowns about this particular virus. So we want to make sure that we do some proper due diligence in that we know what to do moving forward if things do change. And you know, at the bottom it says failure to plan is planning to fail, and that can't be any more accurate than right now. So along that vein, proper planning is really critical. And as business owners, you got to be nimble. You got to be adaptable. Entrepreneurs by nature are kind of that way. They're always kind of analyzing, how can I do things better? How can I make improvements? How can I change the process to make it more efficient? So we're already good at doing these things, but planning plus adaptability will equal success. And that's the bottom line. If you fail to plan, your odds of success go down. If you choose not to adapt, your chances of success go down. So do both of those things. Plan, be nimble, be light on your feet, fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee, right? And we want to be adaptable, move around and adjust. And that's going to get us to our success point. So at that, I don't see any questions on the chat. So if you do have any, please submit those now, and we will kind of go through anything that comes up. If we don't get any, then Amber and I might have a little bit of a different additional conversation, but I'll turn it back over to Mark for the time being.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you, Amber. A great session. We did have one question around seeing these slides I mentioned in the chat box. We will be posting these to our website, the link I posted earlier, right after this session. So those will be available. Again, if you do have questions, you can either throw them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. But until then, Ed, Amber, if you had any additional comments, we've got just a few minutes left, so I'll leave it to you.
All right, that sounds great, Mark. So Amber, here we are. We've thrown a lot of stuff, right? And it looks a little bit overwhelming, but let's take just a moment and boil it back down to the very basics. Where do we start? What do we do? And what's our next step?
Yes, so before I do that, I think I saw a quick question, because I love that as far as going back to the basics, but I saw a question that said, as an employer, can we ask an employee if they've been tested and what their results show? Ed, I'm going to hand this one over to you because that is a very, very sensitive issue.
And the short answer is no, because you're asking them to disclose medical information, and that is information that you're not allowed to legally gather as an employer. Now, you can ask the employee if they've exhibited any symptoms of COVID, but you cannot ask them directly about test results, because that violates their privacy. So once again, there's some fine lines here. We have to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So ask about symptoms, general things, but we can't ask specifically about the disease or test results.
So I want to add to that just a little bit, because I was talking about having that incident, protocol. If you've had an incident to where, you did have an employee that came to you and said, hey, I've tested positive for COVID-19, and so now we're going to do an investigation. We're going to find out what other workers are around, and again, maybe we give those workers the option to self-quarantine for 14 days, or they have the ability to just go and take a test and then come to you and show you the negative results. That's a little bit different from directly going and saying, hey, you guys, have you been tested? And when there's nothing indicating anything otherwise. So I wanted to point that out because Ed's absolutely right with that. And then to go back to Ed's question to kind of to wrap it up, just start somewhere. Do we have another question? We do. I don't see that one.
Can management force an employee to work?
Yep, go ahead.
Perfect. So I'll touch on this really quick because I know we're running out of time, but can you force somebody to come to work? No, you cannot. However, when you put your program in place, you've got all of the different elements, you're doing everything that you can as an employer, you can offer a job to someone, and if they choose to not take it, whether it's out of fear or something like that, again, we are a right to work state. You can then therefore offer that job to somebody else, and then that's where they get into not being able to file the unemployment benefits. And I bring that up because I think that's why that question's being asked, because we're starting to see a lot of people not wanting to return to work because of unemployment. So make sure you're consulting with HR and any attorneys. But again, if you offer a position, you've made all the different, the accommodations and recommendations, and somebody chooses not to take that job, that's different, but you cannot force them. You can just simply offer that job to somebody else. So I saw one more. Go ahead.
One thing I wanted to mention quickly is we did do a session this past Monday that was kind of the legal implications of having your workforce return. I can link to that in the chat, but questions around can you ask about testing, or can you require people to wear masks, or waivers for employees? Do they work? Is that a thing? We had a law firm kind of talking about those issues.
Great.
And so this session is great on kind of OSHA and safety guidelines and all of those things, and everything that you're saying aligns with kind of what our legal partners are also saying. But if you'd like to, people in the line dive more deep into sort of those legal HR questions, I would recommend watching that session from Monday.
And Mark, looks like there is one more. If you have a medical issue which makes you at high risk, is the employer able to terminate you? And under ADA, the answer is no. They cannot discriminate against you just because you are at a higher risk, especially if you have no symptoms or indications that you're actually sick. So that's one of those cases where yes, you might be at high risk, and maybe they're trying to act on your behalf and do their due diligence, but they cannot terminate you simply because of your risk factor. That is a direct violation of ADA.
I know we're running out of time, but really quick, I love the fact that Mark just put that up. Definitely take a look at that previous webinar, especially if they've talked about the legal implications. But in light of these questions, I want to wrap it up with this. This is why, as employers, we need to make sure that we're having good plans in place. We're not jumping right to just forcing PPE. We're not jumping right to just medical exams, and because we can see just based on some of these questions, some of the issues and the implications. Start with the basics. Go back, do the contamination processes, look at those engineering and other administrative controls, because we can see there are some implications involved with this. So start simple, right? Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, no problem. And just to add to that, this also starts to get into questions around emergency FMLA that was passed as part of the CARES Act. Yep. It gets into Arizona's sick leave policy. And so if you encounter these situations, whether an employee comes to you saying that they've tested positive, or if they are showing symptoms or they are at a high risk category, there's a lot of kind of legal HR legalese that's happening in the background that Fenimore Craig, our partners who presented on Monday, address in that session and are available for you to kind of talk to them through if you have more questions around that. So that's the time for this session. I want to once again thank Ed and Amber for another great presentation on safety. Thank you to our participants for joining us, and they'll be back next Thursday, 9 a.m. for another safety session, so stay tuned for that. Ed, again, I'll leave the screen up so that you can, participants, look at this resources slide. And otherwise, I encourage you all to register for next week's sessions and consider joining us tomorrow morning for our session with Facebook Global Marketing.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate everybody participating today.
Thank you, everyone.